All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah, welcome back.
This time, we're going to be focusing on something that's really important for a lot of our listeners out there, especially those of you who are in the crane operation world. So that could be current operators, those of you looking to get certified, or even you risk and safety personnel out there.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It is, and it's all about critical lifts.
Ooh, yeah.
So, I was going through the source material for this one, and it is dense.
It is.
It is a lot of information, but it really boils down to this idea of what is a critical lift and how do we keep everybody safe when we're dealing with them. And I think the best way to think about this is, if you've ever played Jenga.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
There's some moves in Jenga where you're like, oh, this is fine. I can pull this block out, no problem.
Right.
But then there's some where you're like, if I pull this block out, the whole thing's coming down.
The tower's coming down, yeah.
That's kind of what we're talking about with critical lifts.
I like that analogy.
So before we get too far into this, just want to give a big shout out to Safety One Source for supporting us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
Now let's define what a critical lift actually is. I mean, the source material goes into this.
Yeah, it does.
But how would you sum it up?
Well, I mean, just like you said earlier, some people think a critical lift is just, when you're lifting something really big and heavy. But what makes a lift critical is that higher level of risk to people or property, you know?
Okay.
It's not just about the size.
So it's not just about the weight.
Right, exactly.
It's about the potential consequences.
Exactly.
If something goes wrong.
Exactly. If something goes wrong, what could happen? Are we working around people? Are we working around sensitive equipment, expensive equipment? All of those things need to be taken into account.
So thinking back on your career, have you ever encountered a lift that you would classify as absolutely critical?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Early in my career, I was working on a project where we were lifting these prefabricated wall sections. Okay. And they were, pretty big and heavy, but what made it critical was the fact that we were working right next to a busy highway.
Oh, wow.
So, if anything had gone wrong, if a sling had broken or if the crane had tipped over, we could have had a major incident on our hands.
Absolutely. Like you're talking about traffic being stopped, potentially people getting hurt.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a high-stakes situation for sure.
So I'm looking at the source material here, and it says that a lift can be deemed critical by, site supervision project managers, a qualified person, or even company policies. So it seems like there isn't one set definition.
Right. And that's one of the challenges with critical lifts is that there isn't this, one-size-fits-all definition.
Right.
It can vary depending on the industry, the job site, the specific equipment you're using.
That makes sense.
And even the experience level of the crew.
So if I'm an operator moving from, one job to another, how do I know if a lift's going to be considered critical?
Well, that's where communication is so important. You got to talk to the site supervisor. You got to review the lift plan. You got to make sure you understand the specific hazards and risks involved in that particular lift.
And this is probably where having a qualified person is really crucial, right?
Absolutely. A qualified person is someone who has the knowledge and experience to assess the risks and make those critical decisions about how to safely execute a lift.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are going to be looking at things like the weight of the load, the capacity of the crane, the rigging configuration, the weather conditions, all of those factors.
Yeah, it makes sense. You don't want to just have anybody making that call.
Right, exactly.
This has got to be somebody who really understands.
You need to know their stuff,
the intricacies of all this.
Yeah.
So let's say we've got a lift near power lines versus a lift in the middle of a wide open field.
Okay.
How would the critical lift classification likely differ and why?
Well, obviously the lift near power lines is going to be considered much more critical.
Okay.
You have the potential for electrocution, which is a huge risk.
Huge.
So you're going to need much more stringent safety protocols in place. You're going to need to have a qualified person on site. You're going to need to have very specific procedures for how you're going to approach those power lines, how you're going to keep the crane and the load a safe distance away.
So it's not just about, the weight of the object you're picking up.
Right. It's the entire environment.
Just the whole context.
The whole context, yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
For our listeners out there, have you ever been involved in developing a lift plan?
Oh, many times, yeah.
What kind of things did you have to consider when you were putting that together?
Well, first and foremost, you have to identify the hazards. What are the potential things that could go wrong during this lift? Once you've identified the hazards, you have to come up with ways to mitigate those hazards. What kind of safety procedures can we put in place? What kind of equipment do we need to use? What kind of training do our workers need to have?
And it sounds like you're doing all of this before you even
lift a finger.
lift a finger. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to plan it out carefully.
And the source material mentions a non-mandatory Appendix A.
Yes.
I'm not going to go into all the details of that.
Right.
But it seems like that's where a lot of this guidance,
It's a really good resource for this kind of stuff.
this planning and oversight is laid out.
Exactly. It goes into a lot more depth about, risk assessment, communication protocols, emergency procedures, all of those things that are so critical for ensuring a safe lift.
So we've talked a lot about the different factors that go into classifying a critical lift.
We have.
But ultimately, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is just to be aware of the risks,
Okay.
Don't get complacent. Just because you've done 1,000 lists doesn't mean that the next one can't be critical.
Right.
So always take the time to assess the situation, communicate with your team, and follow the proper safety procedures.
And if you see something that doesn't look right,
Speak up.
speak up. Absolutely.
Don't be afraid to say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. Something doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Always. Always.
So here's a final thought for everybody listening. Next time you're on a job site, take a look around, see if you can identify any lifts that might be considered critical.
Yeah.
What are the clues that tip you off?
Yeah. What are those red flags?
Think about what we talked about today and how it applies to the real world.
Put that knowledge to work.
Thanks for joining us for another Safety One Source Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.
Stay safe out there.
Be safe.
See you soon.
All right. See ya.